Very good. All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming back for day 2, the final day of Cryptoeconomic Summit. I had a really great time yesterday. I hope you all did too. Glad to see you again. So this is going to be the session on peer review. And I forget all the rest of the titles of this session. But anyway, what we're going to do is we're going to have 4 talks, about 15 minutes each with 5 minutes for Q&A. At the end, after the 4 talks, what I want to do is have roughly a 40-minute discussion about the peer review policies that we're trying out for the journal and try to get feedback from you all on how to shape the structure of the journal process that we're going to do. But we're going to have 4 talks in this session. So to start off with, I'm very happy to introduce Jason Teutsch from TrueBit.
Thank you. So I'm glad to kick off the second day here and tell you guys a little bit about Tokenized Journal. So this talk is kind of a montage of conversations that I've had with various people over the past couple years. I may have omitted some information, possibly some citations, so feel free to chime in the discussion section. So let's start. Token Journal. So I guess we're all here obviously celebrating the kickoff of this new journal at MIT, so I don't probably have to do too much plug of explain why peer review sort of sets an important standard for communication and building a field of research around cryptocurrencies. So one of the goals, obviously, in the Token Journal, we inherit the need for scientific peer review, and we want to bring this to the cryptocurrency community. But we want to go even a step further. Obviously, this is a kind of radical experiment, as we'll soon see, which is to basically use blockchain and tokenization to improve the scalability and effectiveness of peer review for basic research. So I call this like scalability for the scalability solutions. There are many, certainly in the bubble, we saw more scalability solutions coming out in papers than most of us had time to read, and so, but that doesn't mean that they aren't worth reading. We just have to figure out a way to process them. And of course, going one further step further is to sort of experiment with the utility of these tokens as a store of reputation and how they can sort of unfold and serve the purpose of reputation in the overall academic ecosystem. So we're going to talk about the challenges of sort of incentive design, governance. I mean, they're not unrelated. Obviously, governance, you don't start off with 0. Like, in order to have reputation, you start with some sort of editorial board. So these things play together. Adoption, this is more of like a practical thing. How do we sort of, given the current state of academics, how would we actually gain adoption for a kind of system like this? From an operational point of view, and then applications. Of course, that's more talking about, broadly, how do we apply this journal and reputation to the larger ecosystem, and then I'm going to sort of say, whether you're a dean, a publisher, a researcher, hopefully there's something here for you to think about at the end. So the scope, so the first question is sort of the scope of a journal. Obviously, what we've seen in blockchain is a lot of information being conveyed through alternative sources besides just traditional academic style research articles. I mean, there are white papers of various flavors. We have educational survey articles. I mean, a lot of stuff just comes through. Some people just expect you to outright read their code. So you got software tools, prototypes, and a lot of the information gets transferred through YouTube videos, of course, websites, social media, even blog posts. I mean, I think all of these things are things that add value to the ecosystem, and we can sort of open our minds to sort of how do we incentivize people to contribute in ways that are valuable, and also sort of evaluate, given the vast number of blog posts, how do we sort of sort through them all. And obviously, we want to create something that's not exactly the same as Reddit, because we already have Reddit. And then also sort of broad question of whether we can not, how can we adopt the Token Journal to other fields, besides just blockchains? I mean, different fields have different needs, and also potentially connect them with industries. I mean, this is also something interesting. We have a sort of journal that's working for industries. So fine. So let's start off with a quick look at what a protocol might look like. So again, I'm not guaranteeing any sort of finished product here, but hopefully these are some ideas of parameters that we can think of as we sort of begin this adventure together. So first of all, if you're having a token journal, rule number one is just anyone can be an author. I mean, that's kind of standard for, I think, any journal. At least in principle, it's the standard. I don't know if anybody can actually publish in any journal. Anyone can be a reviewer. That's a little bit more interesting. Obviously, that's part of the scalability approach. And we have that reviews, we actually have the opportunity to say, give more information than just accept or reject in terms of these journals. So there's a way to get sort of more feedback, more information from extracting from the article. These are, and then you also have, in addition to authors, reviewers, you start off still with an editorial board, which is responsible for incentivizing the proper participation and sort of falling back on the governance for the process. And then finally, you have reputation, which we're going to measure in tokens, which is they're non-transferable tokens, so they're a little bit different. Although still, reputation is the currency of academics, is it not? So it's still but that is how it works. You can't necessarily hand it you can endorse someone, you can't necessarily hand them your reputation. So a few questions about how it should work, right? So one question is whether authors and reviewers in this system should be anonymous. Obviously, who decides the question? The authors can always de-anonymize themselves. Reviewers can de-anonymize themselves. But of course, if the reviewers are anonymous, you have a chance that this could result in flame wars, people just saying inflammatory stuff without any repercussions. If the reviewers are not anonymous, then people might be hesitant to say critical things about their peers. If the authors are anonymous, then obviously there's plagiarism, so there are questions here. Another question is sort of how to start off with initial editors, and how is this set sort of updated over time. These are, yeah, right. And so we're doing this totally decentralized, not quite, but we are. So this is another question. Another one is, obviously, processing a large number of articles, you want to somehow manage the amount of spam that comes in. And then we also have questions around privacy. Obviously, if people are anonymous, or how do we implement privacy? Are there zero knowledge proofs? How do we do timestamping? And this is just an example of a project that's led by the Statebox protocol, which is basically a visual programming language where you can design, actually draw the picture of what you want your submission and review publication pipeline to look like, and then it actually transforms into code. So you can sort of play around with that software. This is, they have a little journal site set up. Now I want to talk a little bit go a little bit deeper into the protocol before we drop into operations. But this is sort of a generalization of the journal. Can we not apply? So journal provides reputation. Obviously, we use what in practice, I said the authors are publishing to increase their reputation. I mean, that's sort of a practical aspect of journal publications. And they use it in tenure reviews, job applications, perhaps PC nominations, maybe even VC pitches. So your reputation is useful outside of just sort of this narrow window of being in a journal ecosystem, I guess. So so these are sort of the axioms that I would say you would want to have of a store reputation system. One is that anyone can mint a token. Well, you sure can't stop them from doing that. But somehow the tokens should probably not be transferable, just as reputation is not transferable, and really the reputational value of a given token is only as good as its user. And what do we end up with is kind of a zoo, right? I mean, if you have all these tokens, how do you actually, now we have to deal with the processing of, instead of scaling the scalability solutions, now we have to scale the, sort of like make some sense of these tokens that are flowing around. So how do we manage the tokens? So this is one suggestion that Andy Lewis Pye had, sort of within these two parameters of having what he called non-tradable store of reputation tokens, which have these two properties. One is rate, which basically says, here's the rate at which I'm going to create new tokens, and the promote, which he's talking about sort of a change of labels. So the number of, in other words, let's say you collect enough tokens, then in this particular system, you now have like permission to mint your own tokens. Once you've gained enough reputation, you can endorse somebody else. That's sort of the idea. So he sort of formalizes this with this idea of labels, where you start off with a trusted genesis set. That's your label 0. And then you have your label n+1 users. So for each level, so if you receive enough tokens, from promotions at lower levels, then you can go up to a higher level. And it should be clear this is not exactly, what we're talking about here is not exactly a hierarchy, right? It's sort of, they really are labels, because a label 1 user could receive more label 0 tokens than a label 0 user has. So actually what you want is, what we have done is sort of decoupled this idea of labeling and creating this system of measures under which circumstances you can endorse other people. But then on top of this, each person can, or organization can apply their own comprehension measure to understand how they want to interpret these mess of collection of tokens. If you have 40 from one person and 30 from another and 500 from a third. So I think we probably don't have too much time to go into karma-based ethics, but this is what happens when you read an interesting article 10 minutes before you make your slides. I mean, as reputation is addable, karma is subtractable, so I'll leave it there. So the last thing is, when we talk about adoption, is sort of how do we manage to, how do we actually kick this thing off in practice, given that we sort of have to deal with the current status quo in academics. And so this is an idea which I call the bootstrapping strategy, which is based on conversations I had with Andrew, Julia Koch, and Andy Lewis-Pye, who all sort of suggested similar approach. And obviously, I guess, as we see, DCI comes on this slide too. So the idea is that we want to make a token journal to be consonant with sort of the existing academic system. So this means that authors, so clearly authors rely on traditional publication venues. Every field has their certain methods of publication. You publish in these things enough times, and then you get tenure or you get a job or whatever. On the other hand, these sort of, they're all, when I say a journal you're publishing in, it's always some sort of peer-reviewed journal. And the peer-reviewed journals are mutually exclusive. So you can't submit, well, it's not always true that you can't submit the same. In general, you don't publish an article in the same article in multiple peer-reviewed journals. That just doesn't happen. On the other hand, you can publish an article in a preprint, like ePrint, SSRN. You could appear in an overlay journal like DCI, and this doesn't necessarily conflict with running a peer review submission. So the question that I put forth here is sort of, where does preprint end and peer review begin? That's partly philosophical, partly legal, and it's partly practical. It's what is the publisher actually willing to do? So this was sort of a theory that, again, conversation I had with Andy, where he noted that Archive, for example, has sort of a special status. So there are reputational standards for submission. In other words, you have to somehow be endorsed. So I guess the equation here, Archive plus Reddit does not equal peer review. We see a lot of papers that go on Archive, people comment on Reddit, and then they can still be published in an ordinary peer review. So the properties that he distilled were, A, that Archive is non-commercial. There's no serious typesetting service. I mean, you upload a LaTeX file, but then it just compiles it using the standard software. And then the last thing is that the papers that go on to Archive, as I said, are endorsed, but they're not really refereed. So it's a preprint and not a peer review. But again, I open the question, which of these properties are actually really critical here? And another question that I just generally have is whether measuring paper quality with tokens is actually a form of peer review. So again, point for discussion, operational strategies. So how do we actually sort of establish reputation for tokenized journals, start getting people use it, get it off the ground? And ideas have been sort of tagging along with an existing conference, either like Financial Crypto, which has proceedings, or like CES coming up later this month, which does not. Obviously, add your event here. And if you want to experiment with this, so the author, so Token Journal can, so fine. So I kind of want to wrap things up because so we have a few minutes for questions, but just to sort of recap here, I think there's a lot of opportunities for different folks to get involved here. So if you're interested in protocol research, then there's possibility to experiment with these journal incentives, the submission pipeline, this general idea of sorts, the reputation tokens, and publishers, conference organizers, maybe philosophers, even lawyers sort of can interested in defining the boundary between peer review, preprints, implementing token-based systems, sort of leveraging this boundary, and then sort of we can start to review submissions using journal feedback. Obviously, if you're higher up in the university, we can start to talk to our faculty about issuing reputation tokens. This is further in the future, but of course, using these instead of journal tokens in non-blockchain fields, so broader distribution, and also start hiring postdocs, for example, based on their token reputation scores. So thanks a lot. I'll stop there. Any questions?
Thanks for your talk. I was fascinated by that idea of the karma reputation token. Were you thinking with that if someone's paper is proven to have false findings, that they could then be deducted reputation points? Is that where that was going?
I guess the question becomes, who decides that they were false findings? So insofar as we answer that question, I guess you can, it's bad karma to publish bogus stuff. So maybe you lose some karma, I don't know. You gain reputation, but you lose karma, is that possible? Just throwing it out there. But okay. Yeah.
So can you talk about the aim for the journal, or aims maybe, apart from experimenting and learning, but for example, is the aim to have a journal that has high reputation publications, or what are you aiming for with this ecosystem?
I mean, I think we want to aim for the top, right? But we got to work our way up. I think at this point it's just very experiment. I think, and I also believe that later in the discussion section we'll talk about some more sort of practical steps for moving towards a token journal. But yeah, and I think the protocol itself will become more clear over time as we sort of figure out what's working and what's not working in sort of these experiments. So I don't know if that's just, yeah, please.
Hi, so thanks a lot for this talk. It's super exciting. I've been thinking about similar models like for 2-3 years now, and it's really cool, and I saved most for the discussion part. One thought, though, is that I think, especially when we then talk about reputation, one challenge we have to solve is about identity first. So what is the identity solution that we are using here?
Well, what do you think? I have, first we decide whether we're anonymous or whether we actually have, repeatable identifiers. I mean, I guess if you're a person in real life and you want to attach reputation to yourself, then you can't be completely anonymous. Or maybe the submissions are anonymous and then they become de-anonymized later after you got all the accolades. You can de-anonymize yourself, I guess. So yeah, I guess these are. I agree. That's another sort of parameter that we have to think about for sure.
Thanks for this. I have just a sort of a comment that maybe might be generative more for the discussion, but I'm wondering if, I think there's probably value in looking at other fields that have sort of recently done this sort of bootstrapping, came from nowhere. So the smaller, in a previous life, I did a lot of work on digital humanities, right? And so it's sort of famous as, it's got its like multiple journals, and there's a whole kind of process that they did. They kind of bootstrapped themselves into existence. And specifically, a couple of issues that I know came up there. So one of the activities they have worked very hard at is creating a kind of intellectual history or lineage, right? And so there's already articles out there that have done a little bit of this, but I think that's something that needs to happen. And specifically, what they needed to do was make their work intelligible and visible to people for tenure and promotion, right? And so you mentioned this, and one of the things that comes up there, and I think it's a topic that probably needs to be discussed, is tool development, right? So if you're, or basically just digital pieces of research, right? And this is something that typically tenure promotion is, depending on the field, they don't often understand this because it's not, a regular kind of peer-reviewed sort of thing. So this might be something that we need to kind of consider going forward.
Yep. I guess I'd also comment that, I think it was Samantha's talk yesterday that mentioned sort of legal, the token for peer review in legal, and it gave me the idea, sort of I was thinking about, looking at overlay journals. In the legal field, apparently you send all of your papers to a central repository, and then the different journals are going to sort of, I guess, decide collectively, each one decides if they want to take it or not, instead of sort of what you have in like mathematics, where you'd send one to one journal, and if they say no, then you send it to another. So in some ways it's faster, but it also reminds me of a little bit of an overlay journal, sort of like, I guess, also perhaps the Journal of the ACM, where they'll take a review from Journal of ACM and forward it to another journal, for example. So I think, if we think about sort of, and this goes back to your question as well, tokenizing at the top, if we can get experiments going at that sort of top level of those repositories that are sort of the hubs, then that would be sort of, I think, a goal of this initiative, the experiment. Yeah.
I was wondering what your thoughts about evolution versus revolution here.
In general, I'm in favor of both. But this is the. I think the only way to really look at this is a revolution. I mean, I think at some point we have to jump. There's a point when you go from no token to token, right? So how do we get there? That's the evolution part. So. All right. Thank you very much.